In the year 1900, life expectancy hovered just south of 50 years old. If you died, it was highly likely to be from a fast cause, an acute injury, a sudden accident, or most commonly, an infectious disease. Urban populations were exploding. People lived packed shoulder to shoulder in dense, unsanitary environments, making outbreaks of cholera, tuberculosis, and influenza the leading threats to human life. The response to this mass mortality was the first true iteration of modern healthcare, a system built specifically to combat acute crises. It started in the mid-19th century with the adoption of the germ theory of disease. Scientists like Louis Pasteur proved that illnesses were not caused by miasmas or bad air, but by microscopic organisms that could be studied and neutralized. Joseph Lister applied this biology directly to the operating room, replacing centuries of contaminated surgical habits with rigorous sanitary practices. Robert Koch introduced systematic experimental testing, allowing physicians to reliably identify the exact pathogens responsible for specific infections. 3 centuries of scientific iteration ultimately produced the definitive weapon against fast death: antibiotics. The mass production of penicillin meant that bacterial infections, which had wiped out entire generations, could now be cured with a simple course of pills. This reactive, acute care model, often called Medicine 2.0, remains highly effective. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the viral genome was sequenced within weeks, and targeted vaccines were deployed globally in under a year. Medicine 2.0 is an unparalleled success at intervening in acute crises. But by saving us from dying fast, it has exposed a massive vulnerability in how we handle the process of aging. Because we no longer die of infections in our 30s, the vast majority of us live long enough to face entirely different, slower adversaries. These adversaries are the chronic diseases of aging. They are often categorized as the 4 horsemen: heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, and type 2 diabetes. Together, these 4 pathologies account for the overwhelming majority of adult deaths today. To combat them, we must separate longevity into 2 metrics. The first is chronological lifespan, how many years you remain breathing. The second is healthspan, the quality of those years, where you maintain physical and cognitive capabilities. There's a sharp biological distinction between simply being kept alive by a cocktail of medications in your 80s versus maintaining the physical and mental stamina of your earlier decades. Applying our reactive, acute care playbook to these slow-moving diseases has successfully stretched out the timeline of human survival, but it has failed to preserve our health span. The core structural flaw of Medicine 2.0 is its timeline. The medical system generally waits to intervene until a clinical diagnosis is made. This is a chart illustrating risk prediction timeframes. The clinical trials guiding standard care typically operate on 5 to 10-year horizons. Our diagnostic radar is only scanning the final few years of life, leaving the decades prior entirely dark. But the biological reality is that when someone suffers a sudden heart attack at age 60, the atherosclerotic disease in their coronary arteries likely began progressing 2 decades earlier. You can think of this dynamic like an iceberg. The acute event, the diagnosis of a tumor or a heart attack, is just the visible tip above the water. By the time an oncologist detects a late-stage cancer or a neurologist diagnoses Alzheimer's, the disease has been expanding steadily, silently beneath the surface for years. Down here, the structural foundations are built by compounding risk factors. These include elevated levels of atherogenic lipoproteins, like ApoB, and rising cellular insulin resistance. This metabolic dysfunction is particularly critical. It acts as a shared biological driver, simultaneously accelerating the risk profiles for cardiovascular disease, cancer, and neurodegeneration. If a medical system waits until the very top of that iceberg breaches the surface to initiate treatment, it is stepping in after the disease has already secured its foothold. Physician and researcher Dr. Peter Attia argues that surviving the 4 horsemen requires a conceptual shift away from reactive treatments toward a proactive strategy. He calls this framework Medicine 3.0. Medicine 3.0 rests on 4 pillars. The first is an absolute prioritization of early prevention over late-stage acute treatment. Second, it shifts away from strictly evidence-based guidelines, which dictate care based on average results from broad clinical trials. Instead, it practices evidence-informed medicine, which translates that data down to the unique genetic and physiological profile of the individual patient. Third, it demands a highly objective, nuanced approach to risk assessment. It weighs the statistical risks of an early intervention against the severe compounding danger of taking no action at all. Waiting to act on an elevated lipid profile today, just because it does not yet meet the threshold for a clinical diagnosis, guarantees that the damage will accumulate unchecked. Finally, the fourth pillar prioritizes maximizing Healthspan. The objective is to preserve the highest possible quality of cognitive and physical function, not simply to delay the date of death. Medicine 3.0 is designed to generate what ATIA terms longevity alpha, a quantifiable advantage over the standard aging curve, secured by identifying and neutralizing causal agents decades before they become symptoms. A proactive medical strategy requires precise, daily tactical execution. To structure those tactics, we have to look ahead to the marginal decade, the final 10 years of a person's life. This brings us to the centenarian decathlon. It is a specific training framework designed entirely around the physical demands of that final decade. The decathlon consists of 10 functional tasks you want to be able to perform for the rest of your life. This list includes lifting a 20-pound suitcase into an overhead compartment, picking up a young child, and getting up off the floor using only a single arm for support. Achieving these tasks in your marginal decade requires confronting biological entropy. As humans age, muscle mass, strength, and maximum aerobic capacity undergo precipitous decay. This chart shows the necessary reverse engineering. Because of that natural downward curve, a person who wants the baseline strength to lift 20 pounds at age 90 must train to comfortably lift 50 pounds at age 50. This physical decline can be actively resisted. Fitness pioneer Jack LaLanne maintained an intense daily strength and endurance regimen into his 90s, proving that the decrepit stereotype of aging is not a mandatory biological default. This bar chart measures all-cause mortality risk against cardiovascular fitness. As a patient moves from the lowest percentiles of VO2 max up into the high and extreme ranges, their relative mortality risk plummets. Statistically, exercise operates as the single most potent exogenous molecule in the longevity toolkit, outperforming any pharmaceutical intervention at delaying chronic disease. Securing these benefits requires specific training across 4 distinct physiological vectors: baseline aerobic efficiency, maximum aerobic output, muscular strength, and joint stability. Aging cannot be treated as a passive, inevitable decline. It is a highly demanding athletic event that requires decades of deliberate, targeted preparation. Executing this daily preparation requires overcoming hyperbolic discounting. This is the cognitive bias that causes humans to choose the immediate gratification of resting today over securing physical autonomy 30 years from now. This graph illustrates how building a physiological reserve functions exactly like compounding financial interest. Early, consistent deposits of aerobic conditioning and heavy resistance training yield exponential returns. They build the dense mitochondria and structural muscle tissue required to live independently in your final years. Medicine 2.0 treats the patient as a passive passenger, carried along until something breaks. Medicine 3.0 demands you navigate your own biology. You are on constant iceberg duty, utilizing advanced lipid panels and continuous glucose monitoring to steer clear of the 4 horsemen. Your biological health strategy is the most complex and vital portfolio you will ever manage. Ultimately, hope is not a medical strategy. The rigorous, uncompromising tactical choices you make today are the only currency that will buy your freedom in the marginal decade.